London is outraged by the US president's attempts to conduct a direct dialogue with the Kremlin over the heads of Ukrainians and other Europeans. This is reported by the British The Times. I just had a long and very productive phone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's countries, Trump wrote on social media after a call to the Kremlin. Although British officials were braced for bad news, Trump's decision to call Putin first and leave Zelensky behind was a major blow. The Times reports. Worst of all, Trump later avoided answering a direct question at an Oval Office press conference about whether he considered Ukraine an equal partner in the talks. Some of us thought the Ukrainians did not fight for 3 years, losing their sons and daughters to be excluded from discussions about their future. I mean, if I were them, I would have the same message for Trump as those who were on Snake Island, an unnamed source at the UK Ministry of Defence told The Times, referring to the Russian warship slogan. The following day, London issued an official statement in which, in restrained language, it emphasized the inadmissibility of negotiations with the Kremlin bypassing Ukraine. However, an unnamed British official spoken to by the authors of the publication acknowledged that it was unlikely that any European country would be able to significantly influence the negotiations with Moscow until it agreed to deploy its own troops in Ukraine as peacekeepers. However, this does not mean that Europeans do not care. Trump's call to Putin is already being actively compared to the Munich Agreement of 1938, under which Britain and France gave part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler without asking Prague's opinion. Richard Coles, a conservative Latvian MEP, tweeted, "Munich 2. Europe, brace yourself." Senior European diplomats said Trump and his administration had thrown Ukraine under the bus. One said key concessions were made up front, while another said it was disastrous. Weaken our position before negotiations even started. Why do this? Ukraine promised rare earths in exchange. What did Russia promise? Nothing. They continue with their imperial ambitions.
The U.S. government will impose sanctions against Russia and send its troops to Ukraine if the Russian dictator refuses to negotiate an end to the war. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance made this statement in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. According to him, these measures may be needed to push Putin to an agreement with Ukraine. The American vice president said Ukraine must have sovereign independence. Otherwise, according to Vance, the United States will impose sanctions on Moscow and possibly start military action if Putin does not agree to a peace deal with Ukraine that guarantees Kiev's long-term independence. Vance said the option of sending U.S. troops to Ukraine if Moscow fails to negotiate in good faith remains on the table. As the Wall Street Journal noted, the politician made this statement in a much tougher tone than Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who the day before said the U.S. would not send troops to Ukraine. President Donald Trump's announcement of talks with Russia has given Russian dictator Vladimir Putin what he has long demanded: direct talks with the United States on Ukraine. As the Wall Street Journal writes, the Kremlin has long tried to exclude Ukraine and its European allies from such negotiations. Moscow has hinted that Washington is responsible for prolonging the war, so only it can negotiate with Russia to end it. But if we are guided by Putin's stated positions on Ukraine, then the negotiations promised by Trump will be long and drawn out. Russia will agree to a ceasefire only if the U.S. stops supporting Ukraine and restrictions are imposed on its ability to defend its territory, the publication wrote. Analysts say Putin is willing to play the long game to get the U.S. to strike a hard bargain on his terms. Military experts added that Russia could continue to fight Ukraine for at least another year and a half with the manpower and weapons it has. This is an interim victory for now. Putin's ultimate victory is to ensure that Ukraine does not fall into the Western camp and is not deprived of the opportunity to make sovereign choices about its security measures, said Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Eurasia Center in Berlin.
The Danish Defence Ministry's main intelligence directorate stated that the Kremlin is ready for war with NATO due to the US's non-intervention, the weakness of the alliance itself, and the shift in the balance of power. If NATO continues to fail to rearm, then within 6 months after the end of the war in Ukraine, Moscow could begin a military conflict with the alliance. There is no such threat at the moment, but it will only grow with each passing year if NATO members continue to do nothing. The Kremlin began reforming its army in 2022 and has been fully rearming it since 2024. Military aid from Iran and North Korea, as well as material support from China, have allowed Putin to free up additional resources. Denmark has stated that there is no decision yet to start a war with NATO countries, but the Kremlin has all the necessary potential to start a conflict. At the moment, Russia is restrained by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, but as forces are redistributed, the situation could change dramatically. Once the Kremlin sees that NATO countries are divided or weakened, it will not be difficult for it to attack several members of the alliance at once. The Kremlin is not currently making plans for war with NATO, as it is fighting against Ukraine. However, once the war ends or is frozen, the Kremlin will have significant military resources available. If NATO members continue to do nothing, the Kremlin could attack one of the alliance members within 6 months of the end of the war in Ukraine. And in 2 years, Moscow would be ready to wage war against several NATO countries in the Baltic region. In 5 years, if the US still fails to intervene, the Kremlin could unleash a full-scale war on the European continent. As speculation mounts over possible negotiations to end the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is important to understand the nature of the war unleashed by Vladimir Putin almost 3 years ago. Crucially, this is not a conventional war for land that can be resolved by offering limited territorial concessions. Putin's goals are far more ambitious. He is waging the current war in order to undermine the existing international security architecture and replace it with a new world order where a handful of great powers are able to dominate their neighbors. A nuclear apocalypse will prove inevitable if Russia's adversaries do not realize the impossibility of bringing Moscow to its knees or inflicting a strategic defeat on it, Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev said on his VKontakte page. Commenting on the outcome of the conversation between Russian President Vladimir Putin and his US counterpart, Donald Trump, he pointed out that Moscow's opponents must realize as soon as possible the fruitlessness of attempts to inflict defeat on it and engage in diplomacy. If they don't, we'll get back to where we were. The doomsday clock will keep on ticking towards midnight, and then we will surely behold a pale horse, and the horseman's name will be death. He cited a quote from the book of the Revelation. According to the official, contacts and consultations are much more valuable than chest thumping and the desire to see the strategic defeat of a country like Russia. That would be a very dangerous thing anyway, because it is impossible to bring us to our knees. The quicker our adversaries realize this, the better, Medvedev said. Medvedev wrote that the US attempt to dominate the entire world under former President Joe Biden was a grave mistake that nearly cost humanity its existence. It's just that, at some point, the US appointed itself as the leading country of our planet. It decided that it had the right to rule the world, the right to impose unlawful sanctions, the right to deprive our citizens of their freedom, the right to wage hybrid wars against our people, and the right to execute and pardon. This was a grave mistake that nearly cost humanity its existence on Earth, Medvedev said. No previous government in Washington had done so until Biden's team came to power, Medvedev noted. Yes, we argued with America to the point of fury, sometimes on the verge of a direct clash. However, no one imposed personal sanctions against Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Brezhnev during the Afghan conflict, or blocked contacts between the leaders. On the contrary, they continued to communicate, which allowed them to overcome crisis, Medvedev emphasized. He said that the conversation between Russian President Vladimir Putin and the US leader Donald Trump, which took place the day before, is truly significant, as the world was on the verge of the apocalypse due to the collapse of relations between the two countries. The talk between the Russian and US presidents has finally taken place, which is very important in itself. The previous US administration cancelled all high-level contacts in an attempt to punish and humiliate Russia. As a result, the world was teetering on the brink of apocalypse, Medvedev said. Peace through force, you say? Sometimes this concept really works. For example, demonstrating a real, not invented by someone, balance of power. Like today in Kiev after the arrival of our missiles and UAVs, Medvedev wrote. As a result of a missile strike on Kyiv on the night of February the 12th, one person was killed and 3 others, including a child, were injured. Medvedev also called the statements of Ukrainian leader about exchanging territories with the Russian Federation Nonsense. For such people, the only way to heal is to feel Russian again, on the advice of the US president, Medvedev said.